Hello, this YouTube video is about the microeconomics of the opioid epidemic. It is a great starting place, I will say, as well, to begin studying for your Unit 2 exam. But I will say and emphasize starting place. It should not be the be-all and end-all of your studying. The main reason is I'm not going to go into or talk a lot about government interventions in markets in this video. I may create other videos and link them in the description, or include links to other YouTube videos that can help you study those topics, which I am admittedly going to say are not going to be featured heavily in this video. So I think that this is a great starting point, but should not be the end place of your studying. The reason why I'm not going to make it an exhaustive YouTube video is, one, because of length, and also two, because I really want to highlight only really going to, I hope you take away as much as possible from microeconomics, but realistically, you're going to take away a lot of the conceptual ideas of microeconomics and maybe forget how to calculate elasticity, for example, and that's okay. But I want you to still have them in the back of your mind as you're thinking about complex problems and social issues in the future. So this is going to serve to highlight, the broad conceptual ideas of microeconomics and how they can help explain the opioid epidemic, and how the opioid epidemic in turn has helped us learn these microeconomic concepts. Also, I will say too that this video can help you formulate the Unit 2 exam. We're going to start thinking about solutions to the opioid epidemic. It can help you formulate those solutions. Not going to be PowerPoint this time, but Microsoft Whiteboard. Okay, let me show you the agenda. Oh. So these are the major topics in Unit 2. So this is the Unit 2 review agenda. In particular, I'm not going to go very heavily into elasticities and calculating elasticities. I'm going to admit this. And then I'm also not going to go very heavily into market equilibriums, government interventions, etc. The only, I guess, lengthy examples that I'm going to go into are demand and supply. We are going to talk about that. Okay. So demand. We talked about demand. The law of demand is pretty intuitive. So law of demand right here, all else equal, ceteris paribus, quantity demanded increases as the price falls. And we talked about that. So increases quantity demand as the price falls. That's my little notation that I made earlier. That's pretty intuitive to a lot of us. A lot of us are like, yeah, of course, I'm individually going to buy something if it's cheaper. I think we need to really kind of dig into the different mechanisms for why the demand curve is downward sloping in particular, because it's going to help us understand the interaction between the Oxycontin or legal opioid market and illegal opioid markets, and how price plays an important role in people choosing to leave the legal opioid market for the illegal opioid market. When we talk about, of course, the opioid epidemic. So if price goes down, quantity demanded increases. We're going to learn about three mechanisms that explain why. Three mechanisms that explain the downward sloping demand curve. And the first mechanism is the law of diminishing marginal utility. the demand schedule. I just wanted to include a demand schedule, even though we stopped talking about them a lot, just to include them. So just to refresh your memory, key vocabulary. But here's the demand curve. And so you can imagine that this is my curve, right? For something is just like the aggregate of several individual demand curves. So for our purposes, we're just going to say that this is Mr. Diaz's demand curve. Mr. Diaz demand curve for ice cream. And so the law of diminishing marginal utility, all that says is that a consumer gets less satisfaction for each additional unit buy or acquire. And so utility, remember, means satisfaction, is measured here in monetary values. So all this demand curve, Mr. Diaz's demand curve for ice cream, so remember this is not a market demand curve, says is that at one ice cream cone, Mr. Diaz is willing to pay $2.75. At two ice cream cones, that second ice cream cone, Mr. Diaz is willing to pay $2.50 for each ice cream cone. At three ice cream cones, Mr. Diaz, if he's going to acquire, at four ice cream cones, Mr. Diaz is willing to pay $2. The reason why Mr. Diaz is willing to pay less and less with each ice cream cone as he is in this fictional universe where Mr. Diaz is buying four ice cream cones, is because the first ice cream cone may be highly desired. I may get a lot of utility from that first ice cream cone. But that second ice cream cone, I may not get as much utility. Because, yeah, the second one's okay, but I mean, the first one was really delicious, and I think we all understand this intuitively. At that third ice cream cone, it starts getting a little, well, maybe a little too much. And maybe that first ice cream cone was really important to me, so that's why I valued it so highly. But with each additional ice cream cone, I value it less and less. So that explains why an individual's demand curve is downward sloping, right? Ice cream cone might have been used, maybe I had a lot of food, you know, I hadn't eaten all day, and then I went to McDonald's, I guess, and got an ice cream cone and ate it. So maybe it had a lot of utility because it was helping, you know, stave off hunger itself. But that second, third ice cream cone, as I progressively get more and more, I'm going to get tired of it. So the law of diminishing marginal returns is one mechanism that explains a downward sloping demand curve. There are other two mechanisms that explain a downward sloping demand curve, the income effect and then the substitution effect. So the income effect says, and it's pretty intuitive, that in this market for Oxycontin, now we're kind of trying to switch to the opioid. Good. Purchase maybe $4. $3 for a, let's see, I guess an 80 milligram tablet, just one tablet. One tablet. It's pretty intuitive as well. So this downward sloping demand curve, the income effects says that if you're spending $3, so let's the market going to be saving $1 because maybe a lot of people were willing to pay $4 for it, but you're going to be saving $1, and with that additional $1 saved, maybe an individual is going to buy more Oxycontin. So pretty simple, right? Of course, this is a very simplified market, and I want to preface my remarks by saying, like, obviously Oxycontin comes, you can't just buy it over the counter, you can't just buy it at the store, you have to get a prescription. And I forgot to plug my other YouTube video that I included where I kind of describe, you know, the causes of the opioid epidemic, you know, it's the dynamics of the opioid epidemic. So please look at it in the description. But just for, you know, just to keep things simple, we're just going to assume that you could be able to purchase an opioid, you know, pretty simply, like in any other market good. What I will say too is some of you probably already raised this and have raised this with me before, is this idea that does the law of diminishing marginal utility apply to drugs like opioids? Because Mr. Diaz, we did talk a lot about how people, the opioid market is very special because addiction, and so don't more and more people get more marginal utility with each additional unit of the good of opioid being produced? Like, does it call into question the law of diminishing marginal utility because people might have a higher tolerance and they might be requiring more and more tablets? I would say these are good points to think about. And I will say that there is going to be a place for understanding how microeconomics can help us understand the opioid epidemic when we talk about mechanisms that explain why demand curves are downward sloping. And I will say that in the opioid market, in the legal and illegal, I think people are still there are still downward sloping demand curves. And there's some research that I included in the description that you can take a look at that suggests that bears true as well. So I will say that we're just going to push that question for a later portion in this video. I forgot to address the institution fact, and this one I think is important for understanding, you know, the opioid epidemic as well. And so the reason we found out a lot of people started switching from opioids, we found out that a lot of people were going to prescription mills where people were just, where doctors were just prescribing them opioids, or they were maybe even hurting themselves to get opioid prescriptions, etc., or buying people's opioid prescriptions that were given to them from them. People might exit this market, right? Especially if they become addicted, if there's a substitute, right? So at $4 for one tablet, we heroin fentanyl much more potent. Heroin and fentanyl. They're much cheaper and much more potent. And so people might not be willing to pay $4 for one tablet of Oxycontin when they can pay a significantly cheaper price for more heroin that is much more potent. I don't know, like, obviously, but you can see why this leads to a downward sloping demand curve as well, because at this price point, at $4, there's going to be lower quantity demanded of that good, a lower quantity demanded of Oxycontin, because people are going to be more willing to take the risk, and they're going to say, I'm just going to enter the heroin market. Of course, the heroin market is an illegal market. It's still a market, but people are still sensitive to these prices, as we've seen. Maybe at $3, people are less willing to take the risk to enter the heroin and fentanyl market because they know it's super dangerous, even more dangerous than prescription opioids. And let's say $2, a lot more people, there's higher quantity demanded of tablets, etc. So we can see, I guess, the logic behind that. these quantities, sorry, since this is a market, these quantities actually probably need to be a lot bigger. So we're just going to put 3,000. So it'd be like 1,000 1 milligram tablets, 4,000 1 milligram tablets, etc. Sorry if I confused you. But like the quantity demanded, you can see it, or 1,080 milligram tablets will be demanded. 2,000, because this is a market. This isn't just an individual demand curve. I'm sorry for making that mistake. So let me just point. That would make more sense if the quantities were smaller, but it's not. My bad. I'm so sorry, guys, for confusing you. But we can see those three mechanisms for why demand curve is downward sloping. All right, let's continue. So now I wanted to get into, sorry, I'm checking my notes. Introduction to shifts of the demand curve. And so first I wanted to just say and point out that a lot of people are having trouble. A lot of students of economics have trouble understanding what the difference between quantity demanded, Mr. Diaz, and demand. So quantity demanded is a specific point on the demand curve that correlates to a specific price, right? So maybe this is quantity demanded, this is quantity demanded. Demand is the whole curve. Demand is the whole curve, right? And so when we see a change in quantity demanded, when we see a change in quantity demanded, that comes, right? So if the price of Oxycontin decreases, then we would describe that as a change in quantity demanded, and we would expect a greater number of quantity demanded, right, if the price decreases. So this would be quantity demanded 1, this would be quantity demanded 2. If the price increases, you would expect more quantity demanded. So we express change in quantity demanded in terms of movement along the demand curve. We express change in demand in terms of shifts. We express change in terms of demand in terms of shifts. So shifts either left of the demand curve or shifts either right of the demand curve. And so the easy way for us to remember or memorize this, and this is what I used to tell the students I used to tutor at Georgetown when I used to tutor microeconomics and macroeconomics, was that the price of a good, or I'm sorry, if you get a word problem that says that the price has changed, right? That is that the price has changed, you're going to, of whatever relevant market, you're probably going to see a movement along either the demand or supply curve. If you get a word problem that talks about something external to this market that has nothing to do with price, but affects, has nothing to do with price, you're probably going to get a shift in the demand curve or the supply curve. So what are the types of things that shift demand and supply? Or shift demand? We are not getting into supply yet. There's stuff like consumers' preferences, consumers' information, consumer income. So consumers tend to spend more. If they get more income, they might want to spend more money on normal goods than inferior goods. We've talked about that in class. We'll talk about it in a bit. Number of consumers in the market versus complements. And so we'll look at this market for Oxycontin, and we'll assume, again, this is maybe 1,000. I'm not putting units here, guys, only because it's really hard to write with this. So I apologize in advance. 3,000 1 milligram tablets demanded in this market. And then at $1, $2, $3, $4, right? And so what we get here is whatever, probably closest to 3,000. So what we get here is a pretty basic demand curve, right? And we can imagine that if price changed, then we would describe it as a change in quantity demanded. But there are stuff external to price changes that can impact demand. And so stuff like that would include something you can imagine in the market for OxyContin, a rightward shift in demand. So in particular, we talked about, this would be demand 2, something that would be cause a rightward shift in demand for OxyContin when we explained that in the 1990s, before the 1990s, there was a stigma associated with opioids for treating pain. People thought it was a bad idea to treat opioids with pain, and reasonably so, because people thought it was addictive, right? And so that goes away in the 1990s because there's more, there's this study that is done that has dubious scientific facts or scientific reasoning, and it's pharmaceutical companies that want to produce opioids and sell them to people are touting it as a very important study that claims that 1% of people get addicted to opioids. That, of course, is false. We know that is false now, but certainly it changes consumers' beliefs, right? So maybe if you're someone that has a lot of pain and wants to get it treated, maybe after you're seeing commercials in the news, or I'm sorry, commercials in television that are telling you that opioids are safe, that you're not likely to get addicted, maybe you're more willing to ask your doctor for a prescription of opioids. And so you can see that would change the demand curve, right? That would lead to an increase in demand for opioids. And we would represent that by a rightward shift. Likewise, you can imagine a world where people, you know, watch Mr. Diaz's YouTube video about the dangers of opioids, or see a lot of news reporting that are showing that a lot of people are getting addicted, and maybe people are less willing to try to get their doctors to prescribe them opioids, less willing to listen to their doctors if they prescribe it, and are looking for alternative treatments for pain like physical therapy. You would imagine there would be a leftward shift in the demand for OxyContin. These shifts, predictably, let's just say that this is the price. These shifts in demand would lower the price and lower the quantity demanded. Okay. So we see how shifts work. Rightward shifts would be greater demand, leftward shifts would be less demand. Other things as well, let me think of maybe another example. Okay, we're good there. Overview, shifts in demand, supply. So we talked about the law of supply, which is pretty intuitive as well, which is as price increases, quantity supplied increases. As price decreases, quantity supplied decreases, ceteris paribus, so all else being equal. And so we see this represented by the supply curve. The logic for this is pretty sound. We kind of can understand it if we go back to an earlier concept, a Unit 1 concept called opportunity cost. And so you can think of it like this. Let's say that this is the market for heroin, right? And you're, hopefully you're not, no one should be, you're a drug cartel. And you have a lot of different goods you can Or I'm sorry, we're going to focus on opportunity costs, right? So you have a lot of different goods that you can produce and try to traffic into the United States, or maybe if you're, yeah. So at this price level, you're probably less willing to join the market, right? Maybe you're, in this fictional world, marijuana is more expensive than heroin. And so you're producing and trafficking a lot of marijuana into the United States because it's more expensive. As the price of heroin gets higher and higher, more opportunity cost. We're gonna learn this through the opportunity cost framework we learned in Unit 1 for review. The opportunity cost of just only exclusively producing marijuana becomes greater and greater. And you can see this logic further, right? And let's say at some price point, heroin, the price of heroin is more expensive than the price of marijuana. So with each additional increase in price on the supply curve, you are have a greater opportunity cost for not it's dumb for you not to produce heroin. So there are several different things about the supply curve that we wanted to discuss. Hold on. So first of all, let's go ahead and draw a graph. Or can we just use the demand graph here? Hold on. So we're going to learn about the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. I'm just going to leave this here. So let's go up here. So this is the market for heroin. This is the supply market for Oxycontin, sorry. This is the supply curve for the market of Oxycontin. Let's just say in this fictional world, it's about 2,000 tablets, 2,000 1 milligram tablets for $4. Okay, so the market for Oxycontin, the supply curve is upward sloping, the demand curve is downward sloping. The shifts for this supply curve, so let's think about it. Or, I'm sorry, the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded follows the same logic as the difference between quantity demanded and quantity, the difference between quantity supplied and supply follows the same logic between the difference between quantity demanded and demand. So for example, quantity supplied is one particular point that corresponds to a price on a supply curve. And so the only way that quantity supply changes is if price change. Looking at movements along the supply curve. A shift in supply, however, a shift in supply is represented, or a change in supply or a shift in supply is represented by either a rightward shift in the supply curve or a leftward shift in the supply curve. Pretty simple, right? And what are some things that could change supply? Well, in the market for Oxycontin, you can imagine there are several things that could change supply. And then we'll go ahead and look at a heroin market to see what else could change supply. You could imagine, for example, that after a lot of reporting for the opioid epidemic, the government decides to intervene, and they start maybe implementing more regulations against doctors who overprescribe. They start intervening against doctors who overprescribe, implement more prescribe opioids, best practices for prescribing opioids for pain treatment. You can imagine that leading to this, right? A shift in the supply curve, right? And so that government intervention for our purposes gets at one of the solutions for solving the opioid epidemic, right? It's a potential, right? Because in theory, we should have a lower quantity demanded, right? We should expect an increased price as well with these tough, more onerous regulations, but also an increase in quantity demanded. We can also imagine impacts to the supply of the market for OxyContin. Let's say that these pharmaceutical companies depend upon the in Tanzania, and let's say there's a drought and it kills a lot of those fields. So you can imagine that would lead to a leftward shift in supply, much higher price, and much higher quantity, or much lower quantity demanded as well because of the higher price. So supply side solutions to the opioid epidemic are often touted, but this is just the legal market, right? So now let's look at maybe the illegal market for opioids. Let's go to down here, heroin. Market for demand curve right here, supply curve right here. In the market for heroin, you can imagine maybe the DEA and Customs and Border Patrol get more funding, and this leads to a leftward shift in supply, right? DEA, Customs, Border Patrol get more funding, and so you can expect an increase in price. This was originally the market equilibrium price. Let's just say this is $4, and this is 2,000, whatever 2,000 heroin is, I don't know, and then 1,000, right? You can expect a lower quantity of heroin demanded and a higher price point. So, you know, that border funding, or not border funding, but that maybe increased policing of heroin, increased efforts to take express itself as a solution in microeconomic terms with a leftward shift in the supply curve. So we can see that pretty intuitively. However, I don't think that's the full picture. You know, that's not where we'll stop here. Oh, I'm sorry. I also wanted to express a little bit too. There can be different dynamics going on. So, for example, that OxyContin is obviously a substitute for heroin. And so if OxyContin becomes more expensive, the way that we would express this is a rightward shift in the supply curve for heroin, right? Which is kind of dangerous too, because we also have to consider, you know, the ramifications, because we're dealing with, you know, illegal market for opioids, legal market for opioids, and the ramifications of having more people to take illegal opioids, right? Because they're still addicted. So we also have to consider those ramifications when trying to design solutions, right? So maybe you increase regulation for pharmaceutical companies and best, you know, raise the standards for prescribing opioids, but you already have enough people addicted, and so all these impediments raise the price of OxyContin. in so doing so, because heroin is a substitute for Oxycontin, that leads to greater it would lead to greater demand for heroin, right? Because it's a substitute, which would increase the quantity demanded for heroin, which is arguably a more dangerous drug, which is more dangerous than prescription opioids. Also, you can imagine different dynamics playing out at the same time. You can imagine, for example, in the heroin market, leftwards supply curve. Efforts, and then rightward demand curve, right? Because of maybe, let's just say, more young people think heroin's cool. I don't know. Maybe there's just a change in consumer preferences and more people think heroin is safer than it actually is, right? So if there's a leftward shift, that's not the full story too, because you also have to consider demand as well. And if demand shifts right, it might, if it's depending on the magnitude of the shift, it might completely wipe out all the hard work you did to try to make this market, the quantity demanded for this market decrease. It might wipe out all of that, right? All those efforts that you made to kind of solve this opioid epidemic. And so knowing the magnitude of shifts is important when we're designing policy solutions. Now we're going to get into price elasticities. And so the price elasticity of demand is and so inelastic demand, it's pretty inelastic. You can imagine a rubber band and trying to stretch a rubber band and not stretching far. That would be an example of inelastic. An elastic, trying to stretch a rubber band and it's stretching a lot. That would be an example of elastic. So if the quantity demanded of a good is very responsive to price changes, then that is called an elastic. And that good is probably relatively elastic. If it's not very responsive to price changes, that good is probably relatively inelastic. Another way to put it is when consumer behavior is not inelastic. So now let's look at forces of elasticity, factors that contribute to elasticity. So the proportion of income spent on the good, availability of substitutes, the importance of a good, and the ability to delay purchase of a good. So this is kind of where the tolerance and addiction concepts that we discussed about come into play, right? So if opioids are very addictive, right? And so the price of opioids, and when I talk about opioids, the market for opioids, I'm also talking about the illegal market for opioids as well. So if the price for opioids increases, you can imagine a heroin addict is still incredibly addicted to heroin, still incredibly addicted to Oxycontin. They're still going to do everything. They're still probably still purchase opioids because they're addicted. And so that suggests that the market for opioids, the demand curve, is relatively inelastic. And so that has implications, right, for the policy solution or the solutions that we try to draft up to solve this epidemic. The availability of substitutes, we talked about this. And so maybe Oxycontin is a more elastic good relative to heroin because heroin is a substitute, right? And goes up, maybe a lot of people are moving to heroin. So the availability of substitutes, the importance of a good, right? That gets at this idea that addiction makes goods very important. You're not going to be unwilling to, spend money on it, or you're going to be willing to spend money on stuff that you're addicted to, so me and coffee. The ability to delay purchase of a good also matters as well. You can imagine for something like insulin, that's something that you need, right, to survive. That's something a lot of diabetics need to. Not going to. Demand curve for that is going to be relatively inelastic, because even if the price goes up, that's something I still need to budget for now, as opposed to maybe something like, I don't know, going to the movies. And the portion of income spent on the good is also very important. A 20% increase in the price of gum is probably, you're probably still going to buy gum, but a 20% increase in the price of a plane ticket or a cruise, you're probably not going to go travel or go to on a cruise. So elasticities are important for understanding the opioid epidemic. The best way, for obvious reasons, because opioids have, inelastic demand. I think that's safe to say. The best way to teach elasticities, I think, are by thinking inelastic good would be a vertical demand curve, and a perfectly inelastic good would have a horizontal demand curve. So you can imagine that a perfectly inelastic good would be something, I think, like insulin. Insulin is a life-saving drug. You need it. And so whether it be $4 or $3,000, you're going to buy it, right? Because it's your life on the line. And so government intervention, right? Because the reason why inelasticities matter for policymakers and they matter for producers is because inelasticities determine for producers their revenue. Producers can get more revenue if they know the elasticity of their good. Producers are incentivized to raise the price of their good, right? So in a perfectly inelastic good, a producer has no business selling their good unless they're incredibly ethical for this price at $400, when they know that people are still going to pay no matter how much they charge, right? For a perfectly inelastic good, they may still pay $3,000. So this is an example for the price of insulin. So that's maybe this is where the government has a role to play, and the government does play a role in terms of price gouging pharmaceutical companies that try to charge a lot of money for life-saving drugs. The government does cap the amount that they can charge. Does it do a good job? That's up for debate, and that's where we're going to get into more. We're going to get more into that topic when we talk about healthcare in our discussion about monopolies and monopolies. So yeah, a horizontal or perfectly elastic good. The ideal example of this would be something like Coke, not cocaine. I know we're talking a lot about drugs in this video, but like two Coke machines, one Coke machine right next to the other. And if you raise the price of Coke in $1, no one is going to buy from that Coke machine. That's an example of a perfectly elastic good. And it's people are all going to buy from the other Coke machine because it's cheaper, right? It's pretty common sense, right? So these are examples of perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic markets. So why should producers care? Like I said, it comes with unique implications. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's some formula, or here's ways that we can classify elastic and inelastic goods and unit elastic goods. So the percent change in the quantity demanded is greater than the percent change in the price of a good, then it's considered an elastic good or a luxury. If the percent change in quantity demanded is less than the percent change in price, it's considered an inelastic good or a necessity. And if the percent change in quantity demanded is equal to the percent change in price, it's considered unit elastic. there's going to be other videos in the description of this YouTube video that you can click where you see either me or someone else calculate elasticities. Why do businesses care about elasticities? Because total revenue equals price times quantity. And so the more elastic goods, as price increases, their total revenue falls, right? Unit elastic goods increases in prices, total revenue stays the same. But inelastic goods, producers are incentivized to increase their prices because their total revenue is going to increase. And we saw that intuitively. How does this help us understand the opioid epidemic? I don't know if I should do. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do this. I'm going to look at two markets. So these are the markets I drew earlier. No. Let me try to erase this. No. Okay, let me just explain the logic behind this. So here, let me clear this up because it's really bad. I'm sorry. These are really bad drawings. Okay, so these are two different markets with different. The way that we can see the impact of elasticities is pretty obvious, right? So let's say, for whatever reason, I think we can see like the importance or like the logic behind elasticities if we compare opioids to over-the-counter pain medicine like Tylenol, right? Both used to treat Tylenol, or both used to treat pain. So over-the-counter medicine is not addictive as opioids are, and we can imagine that there's a supply curve. So let's just, a shift in supply. We're going to use a shift in supply to help elucidate this concept of elasticities. So we can see that a leftward shift in the supply curve the supply curve, and then price increases to P2 from P1, right? Because this is the market clearing price here. And then the supply curve shifts. Quantity goes from Q star Q1 to this new quantity point, quantity 2. We can see that there's just in this diagram, right? The demand curve for Tylenol, I've tried to show here, is more elastic than the demand curve for opioids, right? The demand curve for opioids right here is more inelastic. It's closer to that perfectly inelastic demand curve, right? And as an increase in price, right, and a significant shift in quantity. If we think of the supply curve, or I'm sorry, the demand curve for opioids as inelastic, which is a reasonable assumption, right, to make. Also, this would be close to inelastic. Sorry, I'm just redoing this. If we see maybe regulatory efforts to try to, or maybe like there is the opium poppy fields in Tanzania get burned down for whatever reason. A lot of them get burned down. And so there's a decrease in the supply of opioids in Afghanistan, just general opioids. We're just going to leave it, the market for opioids legal, whatever. Because they're addictive, we're suggesting that there's probably a more inelastic demand curve, right? In this example, you can see that despite the supply side efforts, right? Despite supply, there is a very small decrease in quantity and a very large increase in price. A lot of important research that needs to be done on how inelastic, opioid markets are, in particular opioid markets in different places, right? A lot of economic research, et cetera, to design perfect policy interventions. But this suggests, like, let's say maybe you want to intervene in like the heroin markets, et cetera, and you're thinking you're doing a really good job because you're trying ultimately to get this quantity down. Really, if the demand curve is inelastic and all of your policy solutions focus on supply, you're raising the price by a lot, but you're not really impacting the actual quantity demanded significantly, right? And I think we can all see that intuitively, right? We can see that on this demand curve, and I think we all understand it intuitively, but now we have a concept in microeconomics that allows us to explain it. Price elasticity of supply is the responsiveness of the quantity supplied to price changes. So the formula is the percent change in quantity supplied by the percent change in price. Here we can think of, maybe we can go to extremes again, and we can dream up different extremes. So let's pretend that these demand curves that we originally said were demand curves, now they're supply curves, perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic. And so we can imagine, again, remember, if you're a producer at higher price levels, you want to produce more. So an example of a perfectly inelastic in the supply curve in the market for opium, maybe in this fictional world, in this fictional opium market, or opioid market, Oxycontin market, the opium fields, like let's say the price increases and you want to manufacture more opioids. Well, let's say you only have fixed opium fields that you can use. So I think most pharmaceutical companies get their opium from Tanzania. And let's say there's a lot more international regulations and there's like a small limited number of fields and you're already maxed out at capacity. Well, you can't change the amount of production of opioids you're making. And it's a very inelastic, probably not perfectly inelastic, but close to this idea fast enough, right? Because there's so many hurdles in your way. So despite the fact that you're incentivized with higher price levels to want to increase production, you can't do that. So that would be an example of close to perfectly inelastic. If there are very little regulations to, growing opium poppies and whatever, and you can grow them anywhere you want, and like the climate is very good, maybe you have a genetically modified opium poppy, etc. There's very little inhibitions. You get closer and closer to this perfectly elastic supply curve. So let's imagine that the price increases for opioids and there's more manufacturers and producers wanting to do it and produce it. Then that would be an example of elastic supply. I think elastic demand, however, is more important for understanding the opioid epidemic. Okay, income elasticities of demand are measures the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to changes in income. So for example, inferior and normal goods, the percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in income is your formula. If you have a negative after you plug it into this formula, then it's an example of an inferior good. If you have a positive, then it's an example of a normal good. So understanding which is a normal good and which is an inferior good, so as income levels for everyone increases, can help us understand what solutions we design can affect or how, or can help us target, solutions for particular people. So for example, if people's income rises over the next 10 years, or let's say the government sends stimulus checks again and increases the income and for people, they send 2,000 stimulus checks. Which is the inferior good? Which is the normal good? So are people going to be more willing to spend money on Oxycontin, or are they going to try to spend money on heroin or fentanyl still? If their percent change in income goes up and they spend a significant amount more money on Oxycontin, then that would be an example of a normal good. And then, of course, heroin would be an example of an inferior good. Cross-price elasticity of demand measures the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of one good to the price of another. So the way you calculate is percent change in quantity demanded of good X over the percent change in quantity demanded of good Y. So if you get a negative, they're complements. If you get a positive, they're substitutes. So we already talked about how Oxycontin is a substitute for heroin. You can imagine, however, there are all kind of complements associated with Oxycontin. Maybe the price of a visit to the doctor's office. So you can imagine if the price for a visit of a doctor's office goes up, that would also affect, Oxycontin sales, because maybe people are less and less willing to go to the doctor and don't end up going, right? So you would get a negative here, and that would suggest that the goods are complements. Understanding, the complements for the market for Oxycontin are important for designing solutions for that market. So go ahead and look at the YouTube videos I've included on other elasticities as well. Market equilibrium and surplus. I'm almost done, guys. So consumer surplus is right here. It's everything below the demand curve. This is a market that is cleared. There's no intervention in this market, and everything above the price. Producer surplus is everything above the supply curve and everything below the price. We'll talk about what these mean conceptually. So right here, consumer surplus is the total benefit from the consumption of a product less the total cost of purchasing it. You can think of it like this, that at several different price points here, people would have been willing to pay, for example, this is rock concert tickets. This is the example, maybe $20, but they don't have to pay. People would have been willing to pay $19, $15, but instead they only have to pay $14. So the consumer surplus describes those willingness to pay at higher price points, but the fact that they only have to pay at this price point, right? So that's what consumer surplus looks like. So it's the benefit. Okay. Using similar logic for consumer surplus, the producer surplus for a market is the area below the market price and above the market supply curve. It's right here, producer surplus. Again, you can think of it as producers willing to pay or to manufacture a good. Several producers are willing to manufacture a good at this price point, at this price point, at this price point, but they get to manufacture a good at a higher price point. So that surplus that they get is like the benefit from the market. So social surplus equals consumer surplus, producer surplus, plus tax revenue. So deadweight loss is a concept that we talked about in class. Deadweight loss is significant for understanding, interventions in marketplaces. So when we don't let markets clear, we do have deadweight loss. Markets become inefficient. So an example of deadweight loss, we're going to look at a couple of examples. I'm not going to go into length with these and discuss their application to the opioid epidemic, because I think the policy solutions that we are going to design is not going to really so much hinge on our understanding of these. I think we have to understand, the significance of government interventions to do well on the exam. So I'm just going to go over them briefly here, but I expect you to look at them, look at the videos in the description to gain a fuller appreciation of the different dynamics involved in specific government interventions. So here's an example of a price ceiling. We discussed price ceilings and floors in class. So a price ceiling, maybe a price ceiling would be put on a particular pharmaceutical good. So you can imagine that this is the market price here. So this is the quantity demanded, or this is the clearing quantity and price here. There's a ceiling that is placed. The government says you can't you can't sell a good for more than this price. And you can imagine that this has significance because there's probably going to be less suppliers willing to manufacture the good. There's a whole lot less suppliers willing to manufacture the good at a lower price point. Maybe they're going to switch to manufacturing something else. And so what you get is a shortage. Right. So you get a lower price point and you get a higher quantity demanded, right? Because it's at a lower price point. You get a lower price point, but a higher quantity demanded, but you have now you have a shortage of goods. Okay, and so right here is deadweight loss. That's the efficiency lost to this government intervention. I will say, however, price ceilings are not, all that bad. Right here we see, a pretty even deadweight loss affecting producers and consumers. But you can imagine if the good is pretty inelastic, like right here, pretty inelastic. And maybe if it's something like insulin, or a pretty inelastic good, a price ceiling might be very welcome. So the price ceiling for people, right? Price ceiling might be incredibly welcome, right? Because maybe suppliers are producing at this high price point and the price ceiling is right here. It's going to right. And so, of course, you would get deadweight loss still. But consumers will benefit depending on the inelasticity or the elasticity of the demand and the supply curves. So elasticities play roles in policy interventions like price ceilings. Here's an example of an excise tax with a tax on producers. You can see right here is like the total revenue. This is the tax revenue. It's part of social surplus. Here's the deadweight loss, consumer surplus, producer surplus. All I would say too, you can imagine if your solutions to solving the opioid epidemic involve taxing a good, you can imagine, consumer and producer surplus being probably an inaccurate description, right? Because if we think opioids are very bad and addictive, maybe consumer surplus is not an appropriate, or doesn't seem intuitive, or doesn't feel like a right description. Well, I'll just put a pause or a pin in that. But here's an example of a government intervention, a tax. So you can look at, other examples of like taxes affecting consumer and producer surplus in videos in the description. But again, elasticities play a role on who actually bears the tax. So if there is inelastic demand, or elastic demand plays a role in whether the consumer or the producer bears the brunt of the tax. And then finally, here's an example of a price floor. Price floors are often used within the context of labor markets. Again, this is a little bit detached from the main theme of this video, which is the opioid epidemic, but I just wanted to introduce these concepts a little bit to remind you about some key concepts that you need to do a lot of self-studying for the Unit 2 exam. So the demand for the supply for labor, demand for labor. So this is a case of like a minimum wage. So if there's a minimum wage at like $10 an hour when the minimum wage before used to be $8, what you get is it has effects on the market, because what you would get is you would get less demand, so people less willing to look for low-skilled workers, but a greater amount of workers that want to enter the marketplace for low-skilled wages. So what you would effectively get is a shortage, or a surplus, I'm sorry, a surplus in the supply of low-skilled wages, but not as much demand. You can also see that this leads to deadweight loss, producer surplus, consumer surplus, etc. Inelasticities matter, and we'll discuss more about this when we get into the wealth and income inequality. So maybe this is kind of like a preview of the wealth and income inequality social problem when we'll talk about Alan Kruger's work on the minimum wage and inelasticities and imperfect markets and all that good stuff when we get into the wealth and income inequality section. So I hope this video was helpful. Remember to study for your test.